My guest today is Tim Fowler. Tim's unique blend of curiosity, determination, and passion for problem solving make him stand out in the cybersecurity world. As a frequent speaker on topics ranging from information security to open source software, Tim's mission is clear: to empower others to take control of their journey and make a positive impact in the world of cybersecurity. Currently, Tim is working as an offensive security analyst for Black Hills Information Security, and he's here today to talk to us about the research he's been doing around cybersecurity in space. And yes, it's as awesome as it sounds. Thank you so much for being with us on the show today, Tim. It's a real honor to have you here.
Thanks. I'm really excited to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah. Before we get into it, I'm always curious about how people got started in technology and how that led to a career in cybersecurity. How did you first get interested in computing, and how did that turn into a career in cybersecurity?
Yeah, I kind of cliche, always been interested in computers and technologies. My dad, he taught me how to build computers at a very early age, and things like that. But it really wasn't until senior year of high school, right after high school, that I really started to get interested in like how technology could benefit me. In fact, I was thinking about this the other day when the Motorola Razr phone came out. It was such a cool phone, but for me, it was actually an enabler because we had Wi-Fi at home. But Dad was really conscious and he disabled it at night so that I wouldn't stay up all hours and stuff like that, like a teenager's prone to do. And what I figured out that using the Razr phone, I could actually use it as a modem with my laptop, and after 9 p.m., because if for a certain generation will understand different data rates and things like that apply, after 9 p.m., I could actually surf the internet for free over the cellular network and stuff. But it really was probably a year or two later that I really started. I got interested in Linux and kind of open source software, like being able to do things for free. And I had an old Dell Inspiron 8100 laptop that had a PCMCIA card slot that we could do a wireless card. And we happened to have a D-Link model that was about the only one that had an Atheros chipset in it. And for the Wi-Fi hackers out there, we all know that the Atheros chipsets were that was the gold standard because it allowed you to do a lot of the wireless attacks and stuff like that. And so I spent 6 weeks trying to just get wireless working in Linux at this time point, which was just an absolute pain.
It was before they had a lot of drivers and stuff, right?
Yeah, it was doing a bunch of stuff with NDS wrapper and it was just, and those distros. I didn't know Linux, which was the first problem at all. And so trying to and I wasn't even dual booting. I was literally having to physically swap IDE hard drives. I'd boot up an XP, do some research, write it all down or print it out, swap the IDE hard drive over to my Linux, and it was crazy. But long story short, I got started really focusing on wireless hacking and stuff, and then I got introduced to virtualization while I was working for a mom and pop IT shop, and that was the thing that set me off because my entire career I've kind of built it on the premise of build it, break it, and learn. And I didn't want to go to jail, and this virtualization capability gave me the ability to build and test these things and play with these things in conjunction with the Wi-Fi. It's now I have a home lab that I can do this stuff. And I was already working in IT for as residential IT and stuff. So I was kind of on the fringe of it. And then I left that and moved into the corporate, actually automotive manufacturing as an IT administrator. And security was not, we had to keep the lights on. And that was a struggle. And so I kind of started finding the deficiencies, going hey, can we do this better? Can we figure this out? And just kind of using that iterative mindset and process that that really took off. Ended up working for an open source router software company, building VPN routers and firmwares and stuff like that. And that combined the wireless, that combined all of the general security stuff as well as some hardware, and from there it took off.
Yeah, no, very cool. And I think I don't want to play the old guy card, but I don't think people can appreciate how hard Linux was, 15, 20 years ago. Like you were saying, like just to get like a wireless card working often meant like reading doc and trying to load things that weren't spec'd for it
Yeah,
and all kinds of stuff.
I have got bad memories and nightmares of trying. Like I mean, because I think I started. I think the first thing I did was like Fedora Core 4. I think is what I was trying, and that was a disaster, at least from the wireless perspective. But it had I can't even remember, what was it, Emerald? I think it was Emerald. The like desktop animation
Oh yeah.
software that you could do like the cube and the multiple like, I mean, it looked amazing, but I couldn't do anything other than like navigate in this animated stuff. And then eventually I think it was 6.10 for Ubuntu, that I finally was able to get enough information and actually get it working reliably. And I remember cracking we had Wi-Fi at the house, but our backyard neighbor had a WEP protected network, and I was like, I want to see what I can do. And so realized how quickly and how easily so we're talking like 2008 probably timeline. Even then, like how ridiculously simple it was. I cracked it, never connected or anything like that, but I was just like, that was that kind of moment of going, this is just way too easy. Like it's got to be harder than this.
And shout out to Ubuntu for actually making Linux so accessible. I've been using that lately for things I'm spinning up at home, and it's almost like the early XP experience where it just recognizes all your drivers. It just works.
I pretty much grew up on Ubuntu as far as my Linux career, both Ubuntu server and Ubuntu desktop. I've tried to be agnostic as much as possible in my career. When I worked in the automotive manufacturer, we were Red Hat / Windows shop. And stuff like that, and try to be as agnostic as possible. But it's like, one of the big, the distro wars the text editor wars within the Linux community and stuff. It's like I can use Vim, I can use VI, but my go-to is Nano. And the only reason for that is not that it's better or anything. It's like, is at the point in time that I was learning, that's what most of the documentation was written for. If you go to these tutorials and stuff, it was for Nano. And so like that's just what I learned on. And as I advanced my abilities and my capabilities in my career, I really tried to become more as agnostic, because I've managed to root many boxes that don't have Nano on it. Okay, all right, cool. You have to learn to live off the land. But yeah, Ubuntu has, and there's been ups and downs and stuff with it, but I'll go off here and try other stuff, and I always come back. I'm a sucker.
All right, so I don't want to get too far off topic. The reason I asked you on the show today is so we could talk about the research you've been doing on cybersecurity in space. Are you ready to dive into that?
Better question is, are you ready? it might be drinking from a fire hose.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. I've seen your talk. You're very, very knowledgeable and very passionate, so I'm excited to get into this. So yeah, like all good stories, I think we should go back and start at the beginning. There's some really interesting history here. I'd love to quickly go over that before getting to present day concerns. Where does the relationship between technology and space start?
So I mean, it's really starts at the beginning of, I mean, really, actually, it predates our experiences in space and things like that. Technology always kind of drives the capability of what we're going to do next. But there's definitely a relationship there, because a lot of things from a space perspective have driven technology improvements, and then space has technology improvements have then rendered space more accessible and things like that. So it's a symbiotic relationship. At times, technology makes the way for space, and then in other ways, space makes the way for technology, just because we can use space to test things. If you look at aspects in our lives that, I mean, even down to like some of the materials that we encounter in our daily lives. Those were developed for special applications of
Teflon.
space. Teflon's a good example and stuff.
Yeah.
Although if nothing sticks to Teflon, how is Teflon sticking to the pan? I still don't understand the physics of that. But yeah, and so there's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing.
Yeah.
But for the most part, I would say that the relationship is space is reliant on the evolution of technology, and we see that more and more in modern times. But it also, space does allow us to flip that on its head. Is once we achieve that capability in space, what can we make this technology do for the future?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess what I was trying to get at, like we see in World War II, Alan Turing, Bletchley Park, they developed the first digital computer to crack the Enigma codes. Post World War II, we see the beginning of something called the Cold War, and then there's October 4th, 1957. What does that date mean to us?
So that date, for people that aren't familiar with space, it's all something we've heard about. That was the USSR launched the first artificial satellite into low Earth orbit. We know it as Sputnik 1. And that was the kind of a glass shattering moment for the world. Because we already had, coming out of World War II, we had things like the German V2 rocket that had already technically flown in space, had reached an altitude of like 62 miles, which is basically the Kármán line, which kind of equates us to space. But as far as the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth, to transmit back to Earth so that signal could be received by ham radio operators all over the world, that was the moment. That was the moment that we entered the space race. The USSR, they got the first shot off. They got the first shot and the second shot off actually in the space race, and it really launched us, specifically like in the United States, like head on into this the space race, what I call space race 1.0, because we've that kind of ended, and then we morphed into another one later. But the Sputnik launching was it reverberated around the world in a way that not too many things have. From a scientific perspective, everybody was just amazed. Like, they did it. Like, the United States was working on it. They just beat us to it. And so the United States was kind of like patting them on the back, kind of good job, and go, from a political perspective, terrifying. Like,
right, because in the background there was also this idea of communism versus democracy which is the better way to build your society. And if the communists are sending people to space and the democracy is not, which one's better?
Yeah, absolutely. Because like, if you the recent movie Oppenheimer, it kind of highlights some of the tensions between democracy and communism and things like that. And so you're talking about in the 1940s and into the 50s. So we're talking about approximately a decade or so later from that, and it hasn't gotten any better. It's manifested itself, and it started to really grow. But becoming more decisive. But there's one, because one of the fears was, whatever the rocket that put Sputnik in orbit, what if it was a warhead and not Sputnik? Like, it's this thing. There's one of my favorite, like, kind of guilty pleasure movies is October Sky, the Homer Hickam story. And there's a scene in that movie where they're in Coalwood, West Virginia, and they're looking up at supposedly seeing Sputnik, and they're listening to it on the radio. And one of the characters says, like, they're going to, the Russians are going to drop a bomb on us or something like that. And another character goes, well, it'd be a waste of a perfectly good bomb, on Coalwood, West Virginia and stuff like that. But like, that was the tensions. It's like, so scientifically, this is amazing. Politically, and societal, it created a lot of unease. A perfect kind of analogy to that happened just last week with this national security threat that came out, where it's some bits and pieces of information where there's just like, all of a sudden, hey, Russia may or may not have this new capability that could potentially disable our satellite communications and stuff. It's like, hey, this is some of those tensions are still prevalent today. But yeah, Sputnik started it all.
Yeah, which then obviously kicked off the US's determination to go to the moon. Kennedy's speech 11 years later, we're on the
Yeah,
moon.
and we won. Like, I mean, definitively, if you plant your flag on a celestial body, you win the space race.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, as Neil Armstrong said, that one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was a historic thing for just all of humanity.
Sure.
Forget the Cold War, forget all of that other stuff. It was absolutely. I mean, a U.S. based company just put a lunar lander on the surface of the moon yesterday for the first time in 52 years,
since 1972, right?
Yeah, it's like like the genesis of all this stuff. It's just absolutely incredible. But along with it becomes there's been some, I don't want to call it dirty little secrets, but there's just, because it was so inaccessible for us for so long, like we don't really understand the ramifications and what's actually possible in terms of space systems and being able to interact with it. But yeah, it all started with Sputnik, and really ramped up into really up until kind of 81, probably with the space shuttle launch. We kind of shifted into a more just scientific approach into space and stuff. Yeah, there's still defense capable satellites and things going up. We came through Star Wars, the SDI initiatives and stuff like that, and what may or may not have actually existed or came out of that, who's to say? But yeah, we've seen just a growth in the reach to get to space and to understand space and be able to operate in space, not just from the United States or Russia, but if you look at India, Japan, most of the European countries under the ESA, the European Space Agency, it's just been incredible.
Yeah, and so one of the next questions I had was, you talked about space programs 1.0. And then, in 1981 was the launch of the Space Shuttle program, which has come and gone since. Is that like a middle period between the Cold War and what we have now with like self-landing rockets, or is that really the beginning of the phase we're in now?
It's maybe both, a little bit. Like I said, it's obviously there was some huge, militaristic endeavors and stuff during the Space Shuttle things. We also had things like the Hubble Space Telescope, and things, and so it was a little bit of as you said, this kind of middle ground. But as far as like when I mentioned the space race 1.0, definitely where we're at now, I classify as space 2.0, and it started, in my opinion, somewhere probably right around 2000. And so from 72 to 2000 is definitely pretty much, you basically take the shuttle era. And that was pretty much, we do have the International Space Station that has obviously produced a ton of amazing science and research and stuff for us during that period. But the modern space race, in my opinion, and I know is really comes down to the democratization of space. If you look at the early history, it was the United States and it was Russia, but more specifically, it was the governments of the United States and Russia. It wasn't individuals.
You had to be a nation state actor to even consider thinking about it.
The budgets were too high. The knowledge was too specific for just general. There was this pipeline from academia and education systems directly into these specialized projects and programs and things like that. But as the internet became a thing, as technology evolved, as cost of things changed, we started to see this paradigm shift. And if you look at the history, I saw a stat yesterday or a couple of days ago where SpaceX in 2023 accounted for over 50% of the launches into space last year. And that's significant because SpaceX is a private company.
Yeah. And I think during your talk, I heard you quote that like before the US would do maybe like 4 launches a year, and now SpaceX is doing like multiple a week.
4 a week. Like, it's insane. Yeah. I think on average there's about 4 space shuttle launches a year, give or take and stuff. And of course there was still some other like rocket based programs going on simultaneously and stuff. Obviously space shuttle primarily focusing on manned space flight and things like that. But yeah, it's just the frequency and the number of what SpaceX and Blue Origin, and there's other players in Europe and stuff like that. I mean, if you even look at like the big three in technology as far as like cloud services, okay, Google, Microsoft, and AWS or Amazon, they all have like space programs now.
Right.
And it's like
Wow.
it's so big. And one of the things that I talk about, I'm actually doing a webcast in next week for BHS on this. Is like talking about the revolution of software-defined radio, and the role it plays in space systems. Because now, for the first time, people like you and me can go buy some cost-effective commodity hardware, and we can start tuning in and start manipulating and decoding and these signals for these systems that used to just sit there completely obscure because nobody could afford to listen to them.
Right.
And that paradigm has gone. And so the democratization of space, the privatization, if you will, a push away from centralized governments and nation states, has really put us into that space race 2.0, where it's unfortunately, for better or worse, it's the billionaires' game now.
I won't say anything about Jeff Bezos's rocket.
I don't have an opinion. I mean, well, I do have an opinion, but nobody's paying me to share it yet. So
yeah. Something we touched on when we spoke the other day that I found interesting and worth mentioning is that there's a difference in mentality in the way these things were built, because the people working on them are very academic and scientific in the way that they think. They don't have the same kind of mindset, I think, as people working in security, which has resulted in a lot of this stuff being built without security as a primary consideration. Can you kind of delve into that and help our listeners understand?
Yeah. So to get, and I want to give 100% like credit to all the people that were working in aerospace in any capacity or whatsoever. You guys are geniuses. You're brilliant, and the way your minds work are just absolutely amazing. Because in most cases, what we're talking about is people that are at the top of their field, designing these systems, doing the math, doing all the calculations and the
down to the milliamp
design. Yeah, I mean, down to understanding. The space is the harshest environment that we can operate in. We can't effectively simulate it accurately here on Earth. It is just absolutely harsh. The constraints that you have to deal with, the fact that it costs so much money to launch a single kilogram up into low Earth orbit. You have to figure out a way to get everything as small as possible, as dense as possible, accounting for every like milliamp of power consumption, for accounting for just all of these different little variables that in cybersecurity we don't ever think about it. Like it's just wires and machines and things like that. It's like I mean, just even like one of the constraints is you can't turn it off and on again with a button.
Yeah.
Like you can't just call somebody, drive get on a rocket, get launch certified, go to training, get on a rocket, fly up, go create a transfer orbit to get in synchronization with that satellite and then push the button. It's not going to work. And so they operating within the constraints of space, because it causes people to become hyper focused. And one of the problems with hyper focus in all aspects is, in most cases, you solve the problem that you're trying to accomplish and you solve it very well. But is the solution only solving that problem? And I'll give you a case and example, and I'm going to talk bad about myself here for a second. So last year I was developing a CubeSat lab for Wild West Hacking Fest, that people could come and play with some of this technology and kind of go hands-on a little bit. And I ran into an issue that is common with radio-based communication, and that's the issue of like packet loss, signal loss, or anything like that, or getting things out of sequence, and things. And so I knew that I needed to have an ability to have the satellite retransmit data, but only specific data that was lost. And so I wrote this retransmission routine. I tested it out. It worked exactly how I wanted it to. It did exactly what I needed it to. It had it checked all the boxes. Perfect. 2 days later, I'm laying in bed. It's like 2:30 in the morning, and I wake up and I'm chuckling to myself. And Unfortunately, I wake my wife up and she goes, "Why are you laughing?" And I go, "I just coded a remote code execution vulnerability in my retransmission routine on my satellite."
Yeah.
And she's like, "That's nice, honey. Go back to sleep." And sure enough, I got up the next morning. I jumped on my computer. I did what logically made sense to me. And sure enough, I got code execution on my satellite over an RF link. And I was like, oh. And then I was like, wait a second. This is a great learning opportunity. It was a reminder for myself, because my code did exactly what I told it to do. It did exactly what I needed it to do. The problem is it didn't only do what I needed it to do. I didn't do the best practices of for cybersecurity and stuff, and I had actually coded a vulnerability in the system, and it's like, that's how incredibly difficult this is. So you take everything, all the constraints that you're working, power budgets and size and mass and orbitals. Like, hey, by the way, guess what? You got all that nice solar panels you've got. Yeah, cool. They're only in sunlight for half an orbit.
Yeah.
It's like, did you take into account?
Did you think about that? Yeah.
Did you think about your power budget now cut in half and stuff like that? Like all these things. And oh, by the way, you've got to make sure everything operates in under every condition perfectly, because I can't, in some cases, I can't just be like, oh yeah, let's go fix that. Let's push a patch.
Yeah.
It may not be possible.
Yeah. And so that makes sense when we talk about like security not being a first tier consideration when building this stuff, because we're so focused on the environment. We come from this academic background. It's been inaccessible to the wider population for a long time because of cost constraints. But when do we start to see this change? I think you talked about a hack on a U.S. Navy satellite that took place at some point.
Yeah. So that was, I think, back 2009 in Brazil. Some intrepid hackers were arrested and charged with commandeering a Navy satellite. The name has left me.
FLT Sat 8 in my notes.
That's it. And they were basically using it to rebroadcast. There is pirate radio of the ultimate form. They were using it for, I think, in conjunction with like CBs and stuff for being able to do stuff. But like even more recent, so tomorrow will be the 2-year anniversary of a genuinely terrifying / epic attack on a satellite operator via sat. And I'm sure they're not celebrating the anniversary and stuff. But in all seriousness, kudos to them and stuff like that. But on the eve of the invasion of Ukraine, we're not going to get political here, but this just the timeline of there was a 2-pronged attack conducted against the K8 satellite portion of the Viasat overall infrastructure network that happened to be servicing the Ukraine and the surrounding areas. And in approximately an hour or so, 45,000-ish modem terminals went offline. Due to which, obviously, for Viasat, this is providing communications, internet services, and things like that. So you've got 45,000 plus customers that are all of a sudden in the dark in terms of communications and stuff. And it was very much that's going to be the case study for years and years and years to come, from people to learn from and things like that. But like it was just 2 years ago that happened. And so like there's been this kind of history of these things, events taking place in space. We were talking about Stuxnet the other day when we were first chatting about how there's some speculation and nobody wants to come on record and go, this is exactly what happened, for the most part, from what I can tell. But effectively, the general gist is that the Asian country, because here again, I don't want to play any politics or anything like that, managed to infect a Indian television station's control center for their satellite through one of their technicians. And this satellite happened to be running, or had the Siemens PLC that was vulnerable to Stuxnet running on it. And this Stuxnet made its way into the ground station network and was able to be propagated to the satellite, rendering it completely useless.
Right.
And so, this was 2010. So, with malware in space, it's a thing,
Yep.
which everybody kind of thinks about, and stuff. And so that kind of transition, it's happening now. But it's going to be it's going to be a slow
Yep.
process, because it's still like space is hard. And it's the I don't think too many organizations are going to be as proactive as I would like them to be. Put the hacker hat on and cybersecurity. Yeah, let's go do this stuff. They're going to drag their feet as much as possible, as they can, until they're forced to do it, either through a regulatory bodies, international or local,
Or catastrophe.
countries and stuff like that, or until things just go really, really. I mean, Viasat, unfortunate for them, but it was one of the better things to happen to the greater kind of space system community and stuff, because Viasat, they did a fantastic job of incident response and triaging and trying to learn and understand what was going on. But once they did that, then they patched some holes, and this entity found some new ones and went after those, and it's like this. So it's this multi-week kind of thing. But then they started sharing with their other partners and their other providers, like, hey, you guys may be vulnerable to these types of attacks and things like that, to try to mitigate against those and stuff. And then you look at the proliferation of Starlink, and then Amazon's Kuiper, Project Kuiper. That's they put their first couple of prototype satellites up in the end of 2023. What's our lives are going to be more so driven by satellites than they already are. So it's important that us as cybersecurity professionals start taking a look at it, and trying to meet the space people kind of in the middle. Because there's not a ton of space cybersecurity experts. There are some, and they're really amazing people. And there's really not a lot of cybersecurity space experts coming from the other side. It's like it's going to have to be a collaboration on both of our parts.
Yeah. So I think we've established like the history of where we got to where we are, and that it's a thing. There's attacks happening. The potential for attacks is going to grow exponentially as our presence goes into space. What's at stake here? You mentioned some stuff in Ukraine already, but like what kind of things can happen in space that are going to affect my day-to-day life? Why would I care if a satellite goes down?
Yeah, so it's a lot of it's going to depend on let me paint some broad pictures here. First of all, if I ask you to drive to my house, you're going to be dependent on GPS to get you here, because it's just everything. So the GPS system is one of those kind of easy ones to get at. But there's a sub element that I love talking about with the GPS systems that actually impacts your day-to-day life more than most people ever realize. Is one of the products of GPS is highly accurate and precise timing. And GPS provides that for us for time synchronization purposes. And our critical infrastructure, our electrical grids, they require these type time infrastructures. Your financial networks, your credit card, MasterCard, Visa, whatever, they require this highly accurate and precise time for synchronization of transactions, or the actual networks can suffer if they get too far. I mean, there's regulations that say they have to stay within 50 to 100 milliseconds or microseconds of synchronization and stuff. And there's default policies. If there's too large of a drift, automatic decline. Imagine just every transaction getting declined, not because there's something going on with the network, it's just because the time is not there. And so, in the electrical system, a lot of our critical infrastructure is tied into this, but even more so, just day in, day out communications. If you happen to have like an iPhone, I think it's starting with iPhone 15, They and you like the E911 system and stuff. There's a thing you can go in there, and it actually has a satellite transmitter or transceiver
Mhm.
in there, that you can make emergency phone calls over. Maybe it's probably, I think it's the Global Star network. I believe. Like that's that's built into the device that we carry in our hands,
Yeah.
and stuff. And so it's pervasive. Like to get a percentage of your traffic and communications and transactions that traverse a satellite link is going to be pretty difficult. To pin, it could be 20%, it could be 10%, depending on where you're at and the type of stuff you do. But the reality is we have a fundamental requirement, and that's not even looking at the defense applications,
Sure.
and militaristic and things
Yeah.
like that, early warning detection systems, and that's why the national security threat situation that came out last week was it definitely piqued my radar, because I'm like, oh, like the ability to knock out, strategically disable specific capabilities of us in space would have lasting and catastrophic effects.
All right. So yeah, very important thing for us to protect. Very important for it to keep running. So when we're talking about space infrastructure, we're mostly talking about satellites. What are the primary components that make up a satellite system?
Yeah, so just for most part, when I'm talking about space systems, I am talking about satellites, because satellite really encompasses any artificial or natural body that is orbiting a celestial body. So, for instance, the International Space Station, it's a really big satellite. While in orbit, the space shuttle was a satellite, and stuff. So I kind of use that the satellite is the generic kind of catch all terms, but there are fundamentally there's depending on your application, if you're not looking at supporting human life, because there's an entire different ecosystem of systems and stuff you have, on your traditional kind of satellite platform, regardless of size. You're going to have components, such as, I mean, first and foremost, you're going to have your communication systems, your comms. This can be a combination of radio, RF, communications, or it could also be optical, which is something that I absolutely am obsessed with and kind of playing with and hoping to have some demonstrations here soon. And moving up from there, you have your computer data handling system with your onboard computer. This is your brains. This is the
Yeah.
thing that's basically making all of the decisions, and producing all of or not necessarily producing all the information, but organizing all the information so that it can be sent back to the ground, for analysis and things like that. You have things called like ADCS, not Active Directory Certificate Services, unfortunately, but Attitude Determination and Control Systems. This is how you maneuver a satellite in terms of relative orientation. You have propulsion systems. You have electrical power systems, which are that's the backbone. If your EPS fails, you're done.
You're done.
Doesn't matter. It's pretty much no recovery. And then you also have your payloads, and your payloads are typically isolated, are considered separate from the actual core of the satellite and stuff. And that can be your depending on what your mission is, Earth observation, whether it's weather, climate, agricultural things like that. Imagery is obviously a very significant one. um Communication, so like in the case of like Viasat or Starlink, their payload is a secondary communication system providing broadband internet access to their users and things like that. There's a lot of intricacies as you kind of get down into that. Like in ADCS, you've got like reaction control systems, and you got magnetorquers, and just a bunch of other little kind of components for being able to manipulate the satellites and stuff like that. But those are pretty much the core components that you're going to find in every space system, at least from the satellite side.
Yeah, and I think most of the people listening can understand technical systems broken down into subsystems and the points where they interact with each other. We all kind of can grok that easily. One of the things that I think is unique in this is the constraints, because, like you'd said, space is this very harsh environment. We can't go up and hit the power reset button. so I know we have limited time. I don't want to go down the wrong rabbit hole for too long, but like, can we just talk about like some of the unique constraints we
Yeah,
see when
yeah.
talking about space systems?
So real quick, obviously power, and you are limited in how much power. Whether it's chemical, in most cases, it's chemical power that you're going to take with you in the form of batteries or whatever like that. You're physically limited to the amount that you can put in by your launch provider, and how much payload can they take, and how much money can you afford to actually to launch this stuff. And so there's a cap of like, I can't launch more than this in terms of power, and so then I have to have the ability to regenerate that power, so that I can stay operational. So that means you have a requirement for power generation, which is typically going to be solar panels, unless you're doing some kind of like RTG, where it's basically thermonuclear and generating power itself. So now you've got to make sure that you have enough solar power to be able to or to maintain the EPS status. But as we mentioned, it's like your solar panels are only going to work half the time.
Mhm.
And only one axis of your satellite is going to be directly facing the sun at any given time. So like in the ones that I built for the lab, I have 6 axes of solar panels, and I was like, oh, I was like, started multiplying my, and then I was
By
like,
6.
oh, it's not that, because you're going to have one that's in direct sunlight. You're going to have 2 that's going to be able to pick up some reflections from the atmosphere of the sun, and then you're going to have the other 3 where they're going to be complete darkness,
Mhm.
doing nothing. And so, just figuring out, it's like, okay, I've got so much power, I can only generate power for half of my orbit. What is the condition? What is the state my satellite needs to be in during that orbit? Because I don't need to, I definitely don't want to be transmitting a lot of on when I'm not able to regenerate power and stuff. So
Yeah.
just the sequence of events is a huge constraint. Thermals. Low Earth orbit, between 400 and 2,000 kilometers above Earth, you will have upwards of a 400 to 500 degree temperature swing every orbit. So you're thinking, let's say 93 minutes for a complete orbit, going from 200 degrees or negative 200 degrees Celsius to 200 degrees Celsius on the sun. And that's happening every 46.5 minutes.
That's
You've
crazy.
got to design a
Yeah.
system that heats up components and then cools
Yeah.
them down.
Yeah.
And do that real. I mean, it's just stuff that we don't
Has
ever think about.
anybody tried a Stirling engine in space? I feel like there's some thermal properties there that could be turned into power, but I'm not a physicist.
I'm not either. I'm not either. And I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night, so I have no idea.
Yeah,
But
I just there's a big gradient there. I feel like
Yeah.
there might be something there.
It's absolute. And different orbits have different requirements and things like that, and constraints and stuff. If you're in low Earth orbit, you have much. You don't necessarily have to have as powerful radios and things like that. Whereas if you're in a medium Earth orbit, or a HEO or a GEO orbit or something, you've got to have extremely powerful radios and transmitters and components, which means you now have to have a beefier EPS, which means the entire thing's bigger, which means the entire project's going to cost millions and millions and millions of dollars more, and it cascades from there. And that's not even talking about like deep space probing and things like that.
Sure. Yeah. And so, like, in all of this, you've talked about the democratization of space, which is kind of where we are, where we're seeing all these launches. We're seeing corporations and civilians even getting satellites up into space. During your talk, you mentioned the Docker container of space, which is these cube satellites.
Yeah.
Do you want to briefly tell us about what these are and how they play?
I was doing a presentation very similar to the one you watched at B-Side St. Louis, and on stage, like, it just like I was just talking about these like CubeSats and what they have meant. So to give you a little background, the CubeSats are it's classified as a pico satellite. They are typically in the form factor of a 10 by 10 by 10 cube, weighing less than 1.33 kilograms. There's actually a specification for this that came out of Cal Poly. The first edition was in 1999, which aligns with that kind of space race 2.0 99 to 2000 transition, because this is very pivotal. But effectively, what CubeSats have allowed us to do, it's kind of been multifaceted, because they're very small. The cost has gone down significantly as far as being how much it costs to launch one of these and stuff. But also, what these launch providers had figured out 20 or so years ago, it's like, hey, I've got a customer that they're paying us $250 million to launch this satellite on this rocket. This rocket has, let's say, 20 tons of capacity. I'm just making these numbers up. And their satellite weighs 15 tons. Well, they're paying for the entire 20-ton capacity payload. What the launch providers goes like, hey, what if we figured out a way that we could launch like some smaller payloads to make up that 5,000 kilogram or ton mass that we're missing, and offset some of the launch costs and stuff like that. And we have ride sharing for satellites. It's Uber for space. And that's pretty much how. And so as that became a thing, we needed to be able to standardize on the form factors and stuff like that. And that's really where the CubeSats came from. And they're measured in units, like if you think of it like rack units, so like a 1U, a 2U, a 3U. 2 and 3Us tend to be the most common. But I think technically it goes up to like 12 is the largest that has been launched and stuff. But it basically gave us a platform that we could fill the gaps in terms of launch. Now there's entire companies like Rocket Labs that all they do is small, like nano satellite launches and stuff, and CubeSats and stuff. Entire missions dedicated to just getting as many satellites as possible into orbit. And with this, it gave us the ability to start really testing new technologies, new scientific equipment and stuff like that in these small, affordable tests where we're not investing the hundreds of millions of dollars and then we turn out it fails. And so we were able to push this stuff down to like universities and research institutions and commercial companies to leverage these new form factors and these capabilities. So it's like, hey, we can build entire businesses and things like that, new technologies by leveraging these CubeSats. And if you want to think about it, like compared to a monolithic satellite, that you would envision, it's the CubeSat's like a Docker container. It's the bare minimum you need to run. It has all those components and stuff, but you can accomplish some of these big monolithic tasks by deploying multiple of them and clusters and if you Kubernetes has actually flown in space. It is actually so there's a thing called K3s, which is a stripped down version. It's got space heritage and stuff like that. So the actual application of containers in space is a legitimate thing. But looking at it from that in the same way that Docker containers kind of revolutionized, even from a virtual machine perspective, CubeSats have done the same thing.
Amazing. Yeah. And that's really the reason like why things like Starlink are possible, right? Because they're putting like 8,000 satellites up in orbit to create a network so we can all have high-speed internet anywhere in the world.
Absolutely. And what you figure the option is the alternative is you have to launch multiple satellites into geosynchronous orbit strategically across the world. And that is extremely expensive. They're extremely big satellites and stuff. And if one of them fails, you're done. Yeah. So you don't get to really have this kind of iterative process and stuff. Whereas Starlink operating in a low Earth orbit, I think their goal was something like 40,000 satellites or something overall. And stuff. It's like, hey, we can afford to lose 1,000 satellites, and we're still okay. And it also that allows for an iterative design. The number of hardware revisions that are flying in Starlink constellation, I have no idea what it is. But I would guess, given the sheer numbers, it's
more than one.
Like it's upwards of 20 probably with just the way they iterate and stuff. That's one of those things. It's like we can save cost. Instead of spending $200 million, we spend $2 million. Well, we could do that 100 times.
Yeah,
and still ultimately probably come out better. But that's also leads to low Earth orbit is going to it's already getting crowded, but it's going to get even worse, and space debris is going to be a big issue that we're actively trying to mitigate and things like that. But
I've often wondered about that too, and I know we're burning through time here, but like one satellite malfunctions, ping pongs off another one, and like how long before the whole thing just gets wrecked by like.
There's an actual term for that, and it's something. It starts with a K, I believe. Effect. Anyway, it's basically that it's the chain reaction of that. One satellite is hit by space debris. It becomes many
More
pieces of
space
space
debris.
debris,
Yeah.
and then it's the similar chain reaction as a nuclear explosion.
Right.
With a single splitting of an atom that produces spare neutrons that then go and split other atoms, and just it cascades. And that's a big actual concern. That's why at least with NASA and things like that, like if we launched, let's say we wanted to launch a satellite for advertisement purposes or whatever, for promotion. We, in part of the certification processes and things like that, we would have to have a 10-year deorbit plan and contingency to make sure that we can that our satellite won't just be floating around there forever, and that it will be able to burn up so that it doesn't pose a risk to other entities operating in space.
Oh, super interesting. Yeah. And if anybody caught that, me and Tim before the show, we're talking about how we can take some of the marketing budget from our companies and actually launch our own satellites. Because it turns out it's much cheaper to launch a satellite in space than to sponsor an F1 team. And I think one's a lot cooler than the other. So
Agreed.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, I know we're getting on in time here, but during your talk, you referenced the work being done by Johannes Wilbold, I think a German PhD student, on a talk he gave at Blackout. And we've got all these CubeSats up in space, and turns out they're not very secure. So this is a bit of a call to arms moment. Can you tell us about this?
Yeah, so Johannes did a presentation at Black Hat. It's actually was just published on the Black Hat YouTube channel a couple of weeks ago. I think it's entitled "Houston, We Have a Problem," which is very apropos.
Yeah.
And effectively, what he talks about is he looked at some various systems, and looked at it from a vulnerability perspective. And long story short, it's very rudimentary problems. Most of them geared in software development. Things like insecure mem copies, leading to buffer overflows that allow them to, in a simulated satellite, take over the satellite and lock out the ground station. With no hopes of them ever regaining access or control of that satellite. Very basic, like almost CTF like type stuff that we would see is really present. And it goes back to that hyper focus on they're just trying to get something to do the mission, and not having the knowledge and the foresight and understanding that, hey, it may do that, but it may do something else. Encryption isn't widely used in space systems or at the level that you would expect it to be. And there's legitimate reasons for that. Not just be like, oh, they don't want to do that. No,
Power consumption even.
You would think, and that's where my mind went. And I love that everybody says that. No, that's not the actual easiest. The biggest reason is key management. More specifically, key management in a highly irradiated environment.
Right.
If you have a bit flip occur because of ionizing radiation, you lose your key. If it hit in that right spot, it's done. Your communication. So you have to have multiple fallback methods, potentially rolling keys in different duplicates and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, you have to fall back to open communication at some point in time, or you're going to lose control of your satellite. It's actually physics. Physics is one of the reasons that people don't encrypt.
I noticed we're at time. Are you good to keep going, or should we wrap it up here?
I'm good.
Okay, awesome. This is great. Yeah, this is going to be a long one for our listeners, but I think everybody will appreciate it. So there's problems. We understand why there's problems. We understand why this is important. Now we're talking about the different systems and the classifications of threats that there are. So you kind of broke it down into three main ones, I think. And let's just talk about ground station threats. Where are we vulnerable there?
So quickly to understand, in space segment or space systems, there's three primary segments: the ground, the space, and the user segment. In the ground segment, that's just really what it sounds like. It's the terrestrial segment of it. It is the most vulnerable by a huge stretch. And the reason why is you have physical locations that are accessible compared to the space space segment. You have people that are interacting with these systems. You have terrestrial networking, internet, and things like that. In fact, the Viasat part of one of the prongs of that attack is they were able to compromise credentials on a VPN that allow them to get access into the ground control networks and things like that. So every cybersecurity, every physical threat, every risk or whatever you want to look at that your organization has that any other organization, those are present. Now the ramifications of that in some cases may be significantly higher and stuff, but like they're not immune to that. One of the things that's happening is we're seeing a big shift into cloud-based ground station controls and things like that. As I mentioned, Azure, AWS, or Microsoft, Amazon, and Google all have what's called ground station as a service, where you plug in your stuff into their infrastructure and network of antennas and stuff like that. So now you don't have to have these physical locations, and you get to utilize the distributed nature of their network and antenna, so you can have more round the clock communication and stuff. But now your entire cloud vector, like identity access management and all of that stuff that we see all the time, that's now your new attack vector. And so imagine breaching a secretary's email account in O365 and through some misconfigurations, actually eventually pivoting to an EC2 instance or into the console, being able to manipulate like Lambda functions that are actually communicating and executing code on the satellite. Like it is absolutely the most critical because it's the most accessible. It's really the accessibility does impact the vulnerable state of it, if you will.
Yeah, and that's wild. And I think if anything, though, that's the thing we're most used to protecting. Like that sounds just like a regular infrastructure for a company. Yeah,
it is. But understand, because that's where, that's where the communications originating from. That's where the control and the command and the telemetry and things like that. That's where the encryption keys are sitting. That's for that encrypted link that they are utilizing and stuff. Like if I can, insider threat is a big issue, or a big risk within ground stations and stuff like that. So it's just take your entire cybersecurity playbook of vulnerabilities and stuff and just throw them, and they're there. They're present.
Yeah. But the possible ramifications are times 10.
Potentially.
Yeah. Okay, so that's the ground systems, and then we're talking about comlink threats. What kind of attacks are these systems vulnerable to?
So primarily they're going to be vulnerable to your standard RF kind of spoofing, replaying, and jamming attacks. Spoofing and replaying can pretty much be mitigated by the use of encryption, as well as authentication, which are is going to be more at the actual packet level and things. But jamming is a big one because it's just who's ever has a bigger radio wins kind of thing, and that's both on both sides, the ground side and the segment side. But it's really the lack of encryption and authorization within the protocols that are being used that allow us to historically have allowed us to be able to listen to these signals, decode them, understand what's going on. And that's, we're seeing a shift in the right direction for that. Perfect example, 2019, some gentlemen in France were able to decode the Falcon 9 Stage 2 LOX camera, the liquid oxygen tank camera feed on their own. And then like a couple of weeks later, SpaceLink encrypted it. Like they published, it's like, hey, we did that. And it was just a live video feed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Within the next couple of launches, SpaceX had encrypted it because they're like, yeah, we probably don't want people. Like somebody was like, oh, nobody's going to do this. Yeah. Somebody did it. They fixed it.
Yeah. It's interesting because reading about these or watching you talk about these in your talk, it reminded me a lot. I did an interview a couple of weeks ago, I think, with a guy named Leonard Koopman, who makes a Wi-Fi defensive product called Enzyme, and these seem a lot like just regular Wi-Fi attacks.
Yeah, it's the
Yeah,
exact same. In fact,
yeah,
most of your attacks that you can that we can think of in terms of cybersecurity, it's the name is different,
right,
but the technique and the approach is very similar.
right.
And so yeah, the Wi-Fi is the great analogy from that, and being able, an open network, being able to eavesdrop on the packets of traffic. If a lot of larger deployments and stuff are using standardized protocols that are pretty well known, so it's just a matter of being able to demodulate those, and then bam, you're able to start to see into data. And then it comes down to what are your secondary and tertiary controls to keep somebody from doing a replay attack, either on either end, towards the ground station or towards a satellite, or and just being able to send bad data, corrupted data. It's it's a really expensive Wi-Fi system.
Yeah. Okay, so the last system we're going to talk about is the space threats and challenges, which I think is probably the one that's more unique than the stuff we see on the ground here.
Yeah, so these are there's a couple of things. So we already talked about space debris as being one. That'd be a kind of a physical threat.
Mm-hmm.
There is technically a physical threat of like interception, like somebody, a nation
Missiles?
state launching. Not even that, like physical human interception.
Okay.
We've captured satellites before with the space shuttle and stuff for repair and things like that.
Right.
And stuff like a nation state could just kind of fly up, drive up, and pick it up, or do something like that. That's
finders keepers.
The likelihood of that actually going undetected is very small, but it is stuff. Software vulnerabilities, as I said, that's the biggest thing. If you look at most of the issues in space missions, it has derived from the software not being able to count for a specific situation or something like that. But then also, I love it. So in cybersecurity, we talk about like resource-based constrained delegation as an attack vector. Well, I joke that we have resource-based constrained abuse and effectively denial of service. So, for instance, if I can get your satellite to do something repetitively or cycle and things like that, I'm consuming your power. And if I can consume your power or force the satellite to consume power at a rate that's greater than its generation, it's going to go down into a steady a sleep state so that it can recharge and stuff. And if I have the ability, once it wakes back up, I just keep doing it again. It basically makes it inoperable. Then there's also anti-satellite weapons, kinetic weapons that we'll say theoretically, because nobody really wants to admit whether we have that capability in space or anything like that.
And wouldn't that be a mutually assured destruction thing? Like, I imagine if you go blow something up, we were talking about the sort of pinball effects. I can't imagine that's a good outcome for anybody involved.
It wouldn't be good. Like, it's not going to go over well. And so definitely some stuff. But then there's also like just the environmental, the harsh, the temperature changes, the effects of radiation on the system. Eventually, the combination of gravity actually, trying to decay your orbit and things like having to compensate for that. Lack of redundancy is a huge problem, because it's like, we were able to afford to get this one thing up there, and we're putting all of our hopes on that one thing. Now, obviously, the larger companies and stuff, they're fully redundant system, gold imaging. There's even intrusion detection and machine learning and AI capabilities on satellites now and stuff. So that's getting a little bit different. But the last one that I want to hit on, supply chain. We talk about supply chain attacks and software and things like that. We look at it. But it's one of the things that have come out of the democratization of space is this commoditization of space hardware, where I can literally go buy an ADCS module. I can go buy an EPS module. I can go buy a structure. I can go buy a solar array. I can go buy a payload board from all these different vendors. I can bolt them together and I can launch them into space.
Yeah.
Which is awesome. Except anything in that supply chain that is vulnerable or potentially compromised.
Hidden back
Not
doors, all
hidden
kinds
back
of stuff.
doors, things
Yeah.
like that. And it's not just me, it's every version of that thing that's out there. And so, definitely the supply chain is definitely a concern. Not so much that the supply chain itself is going to be a problem. It's just if something should compromise that supply chain, what the ramifications could be down the road.
Mm-hmm. All right. So how is this getting better? You mentioned some frameworks for space. Apparently there's a few. Some of them even look like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I'm really curious about this.
Yeah. So there's a couple of like a attack dichotomy or taxonomy frameworks out there that and you could use MITRE ATT&CK framework. One of my favorites to kind of point people to is called Sparta. It's produced by the Aerospace Corporation. If you look it up, it looks just like MITRE. And it maps to MITRE.
Okay.
It's just the attack vectors in the same context, or in the space context, which is really cool. There's another one produced by the ESA, the European Space Agency, called Space Shield. And there's a newer one that's kind of on the scene called TREX, produced by Dr. Jacob Oakley, who definitely I would classify as one of those experts in space cybersecurity kind of things. But these are a way for us to kind of visually understand the attack chains. They do a great job of helping the space people kind of understand what these vectors are. And in the same time, from cybersecurity perspective, it's like, oh, I can see the same thing. Like I'm used to seeing like, oh, this looks like a web app attack path that I did, 2 years ago. It's just, it's not a load balancer and a middleware server and a database. It's a comm system, onboard computer, and the EPS. Oh, I got it. It makes sense. And so, those things are helping. It is getting better. There are tremendous amounts of kind of recommendations and frameworks for securing infrastructure, for securing satellite communications, both from like NIST, from Aerospace Corporation, the various space agencies. There's also a group called CCSDS, and it's the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems. They've got a tremendous number of publications on protocols and implementations and security practices and stuff like that. So there's a lot of data. It's just a matter of getting everybody on board and just doing it, because there hasn't been kind of the strong arm of the law or any really driving force behind, yes, we need to do this. Unfortunately, like I said, the Viasat probably has done more to change the game than anything in the previous 15 years.
Yeah, it's great that those things look like the things we already know. It's like a lot easier for people to take the knowledge that they've built up working in cyber now and jump into this new field, because
it's just the translation layer. You got to understand. As a cybersecurity professional, you need to learn the space terminology, and as a space engineer or practitioner, you got to understand the cybersecurity terms. And once you guys can meet in the middle, then we can start having actual intelligent, actionable conversations on how to improve things.
Okay, so for somebody listening who's super interested, I know you mentioned a bunch of learning resources, and I'll link everything we talk about in the show notes. But maybe you can quickly run us through some of what kind of tools are out there for people to play around and start getting their hands dirty.
So if you're interested in this stuff, there's a couple of good ones to start with. One's going to be called OpenSat Kit. You can find it on GitHub. It utilizes some older versions of a ground station software, as well as NASA's open source core flight system, CFS, which is really cool. NASA's got multiple flight softwares that are open source, including CFS and F Prime, and you can definitely go play around with those. There's also, NASA has what they call the NOS3. It's the NASA operating system for small satellites. It's kind of similar to OpenSat Kit, and that it's a virtual environment for being able to simulate this stuff. There is one of the things that I like playing around. If you like a little bit of hardware and stuff, you can actually build your own tiny GS ground station that uses LoRa to be able to kind of track and get telemetry from satellites and stuff like that. I will give a quick plug, if that's okay. You can cut this
Yeah,
out if
please.
not. I'm actually I'm building a workshop called BIOS. It stands for Bring Your Own Satellite. It's going to be debuting at HackSpaceCon in April, and then I will be releasing basically a modified, updated version of some of these toolkits in a virtual environment, so that you can not only deploy like CFS and stuff, but also custom satellite implementations, various like programming language, Python, things like that. Just get a little more hands-on with a little more updated. And the thing with that is it is lab driven. Like it's like, hey, if you want to look at this, here's the steps to look at this particular impact. Like if you want to show resource abuse as a result of, let's say, a relay attack, like how does that, what does it look like, and how do you execute it and stuff. So that'll be coming out later this year after HackSpaceCon. I'm pretty excited about that. But yeah, there's tons and tons and tons of resources. It's just taking the time and going through and find. There's a new one, a relatively new one, CFS Basecamp, that I'm playing around with. It's a pretty good implementation of CFS. You're going to see a lot that's tied around NASA's core flight system, because that is a legitimate flight proven software.
So cool. Okay, so this is the last one I have for you. It's the one I ask of everybody that comes on the show, and I suspect your answer might be related to space. It can be as wide or as narrow as you want. Do you have any predictions for the future of cybersecurity?
It will get better someday. No. Predictions for the future. I think, as much as I want to believe in the goodwill of people and the desire to do the right things, people's desire to do the right thing is trumped by oftentimes organizational requirements and needs and things like that. That ultimately, in order for us to become successful in better securing our organizations in the future, we're going to have to rely more on the GRC components of cybersecurity to actually be able to pull the necessary levers within our organizations to actually enact and force these changes for good. If we just rely on social media and blog posts and news articles and stuff like that of going, oh, these bad things happen and stuff. It just doesn't it doesn't carry the actual weight of, I am not for compliance. I think compliance is the lowest bar that we can achieve. But if we make compliance in a way that it actually does accomplish something, and helps us be successful at, but we also can't do it in a means that is so complicated and adverse to the business. It's like, we just, risk accepted, move on. We've got to meet them in the middle. We've got to make sure that the recommendations that we have and that we're making can fit and work and operate within the business, because the translation layer between cybersecurity and space is the exact same translation layer between cybersecurity and business. Mm-hmm. If we don't understand the business, we can't help them secure it. And we have to make sure that we are supporting that mission using the tools and the capabilities that we have. And I do see that coming in the future. How long it's going to take, I don't know. Hopefully I'll be alive for it.
I think that's a great observation, because ultimately, like, without the business, there's no budget to pay for the cybersecurity program. And there you go, right?
And it's easy for me to be like, as a pen tester, you need to go do this.
Yeah.
I can do that. I have the power. People pay me for a report that I tell them, you need to go do this. But if I don't put it in the context of why and in some cases how, that they need to do that, and how it will support them, it's what's the point? It doesn't do any good. And so it's very much about having the conversations, having an understanding of where all of the players sit, what all the constraints are that the business is operating in. How can we come up under those and support those and lift everything up, instead of just dragging them down and being the perpetual no. Can we do that? No. No.
What a great chat, Tim. Thank you so much for sharing this super interesting info with us. I know you mentioned a bunch of other resources in your talk, and I'll be sure to just like dump every link I can find in the show notes for people listening, including the link to your talk itself. Would love to chat with you again in the future as this thing unwinds and you do more research. So really appreciate it, sir.
I appreciate the opportunity. It's a blast. I could talk forever and ever and ever about this stuff, but it's exciting. I'm learning a lot, and I definitely I'm really excited about what the next year holds as far as research and stuff like that. Getting the whole purpose of this was to get people interested and get them accessible. And so there's gonna be some cool things coming out over the next year.
Right on. Yeah. And if anybody's listening, I would like to make a coalition to sponsor a satellite. If you're listening and that rings a bell with you, DM me. Who knows? Maybe we can pull this together.
Somebody's Starlink. God, there's Dragonfly, Fireflyers, but like somebody out there's got to be listening. Be like, hey, this would. It might be a little gimmicky, okay, yeah. But I've got use cases. Like C2 in space. Like it'd be like, oh, sorry, I can't issue this command until the satellite is over. Like, yeah, come on, let's make the hacking movies real. It'd be extremely boring, but it will be cool.
Yeah, and much more useful than an F1 car.
Yes, agreed.
Okay, take care, sir. Bye.
Thank you so much.